Well, when a speaker gets invited to come to a place to talk, the first thing they do is they come and they check out the room and see how that's going to work and whether they brought all the right paraphernalia with them. And they look at where they're going to go on the schedule and who they follow and what kind of an act, song, and dance do I have to do. But, you know, I followed Russell. So, I'm going to try to dig myself out of that problem here. This is the first time I've given this talk. It's going to be interesting to see what I say. When you do a talk, you follow a pattern. It's, you tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell it to them, and then you tell them what you told them. This is that first part. So, over here it says, who am I, and why am I here telling you about that? We're going to talk about some background material upon what I decided would be some good things to do to develop a remote viewing program within the Army, and then go over these skills, which is what I came up with things to be done. We're going to go over those in some detail. See if I can point this to the clicker. I wanted to express some attitude of graciousness about this particular facility. I noticed that it was well set up. The Southwest, Arizona, Nevada, Las Vegas area, Mesquite here, is very well set up to receive guests. They do that really well. Lots of visitor activity here. They're really able to handle it, and the decision to have the RV conference here, they even provided, parking. Parking for us. And I guess there was a place right across the driveway here, for a special compound for RVers or something. And I walked by that and I wondered about it too. Down the road a little bit, there was actually a resort. Now, I don't know what you do at an RV resort, You all sit around and imagine having fun or something. What are you doing right now? I don't know. I'm sketching for you. I think it's a great place to have a conference, and, steeped in secrecy some 23 years ago, here I am standing in front of 300 people talking about something that they would have shot me for some years ago, so this will be fun. Now, who am I anyway, and why am I here talking about this? One of the wonderful things about this conference has been that there have been sessions in statistics, sessions in spirituality, and sessions in which you could actually participate and practice in a number of skills. I really liked Greg's presentation about associative remote viewing, Jack Houck and his spoon-bending PK kind of stuff. The ability to actually, interchange and participate rather than sit here and listen to a bunch of speakers use multi-syllable hyphenated words derived from Latin. So I think it's really great, and I want to ask you to participate in something else right now, and that is take a trip through time with me 23 years ago. All my talk is about where I was coming from 23 years ago. So, if you want to stand up in the audience and say, well, that's the stupidest thing, why didn't you do this? And I'd say, hey, that was 23 years ago, So take a trip with me 23 years ago, and let's find out what happened back then. I had discovered, serendipitously, a book called Mind Reach. And at the time, I was a counterintelligence agent for the Army, meaning that I was very interested in preventing the very threatening Soviet Union from collecting secrets from us, tactical and strategic secrets from us. And it was my job then to do all sorts of interesting things, like interview neighbors and friends about you to find out if you should have a security clearance or not, check people to make sure they were locking their safes at night and were handling their classified material correctly, make sure that they didn't talk on the phone using classified information because we knew that the enemy might be listening in to what was being said. That whole system evolved over my career to the mid to late 70s when I became involved with a very elite group of security kinds of specialists, and we called ourselves OPSEC, for operational security at that time. And what we would do as a team is we would attack a U.S. facility, a command. We would attack them with all the intelligence resources available to us. We would fly satellites over the top and take pictures. We'd tap into their telephones and radio conversations. We'd try to sneak into their buildings and so forth and so on. And then we would write up a big report about what we were able to do as a service to that commander and say, this is the picture that a hostile intelligence agency has of your operation. And here are some suggestions about what you might do to protect yourself. So it was a very practical kind of thing. You use everything you can to attack this guy and show him what you found and say, okay, Mr. Commander, it's now time for you to change your actions to protect yourself. And that whole concept was going along quite smoothly and was quite popular. But as a young lieutenant, I became aware of a book called Mind Reach. And I began to read this through the eyes of this counterintelligence officer, saying, holy shit. Literally speaking, that's the way I felt about it. What did it matter if I was convincing people to lock up their documents in safes? What did it matter if I was able to get things scheduled differently so when the Soviet satellites went over, they didn't get to take a picture? What did it matter if they were doing what was described in this book, Mind Reach? So I went to my particular commander at that time, his name was Major Keenan. I went to him and said, I think there might be a problem here. I think that we're not doing something for the clients we serve, the United States Army commands around the world. We are servicing them. It is our responsibility to provide them with the best operational security we can. And we're missing the boat. We're not doing something. And he asked, well, what is that, Lieutenant? What are we not doing? And I said, well, there's this thing called remote viewing. And he said, oh, yes, I've heard of that. As a matter of fact, here's some classified documents on that. And General Thompson, who used to be in charge of this office, was also very interested in that, too. And I said, well, sir, we're not doing anything about this. And he said, no, familiarize yourself with these documents and we'll talk later. Meanwhile, I was off doing one of these surveys, talking to these people about you should secure this, you should do this, and lock your buildings and everything else. And at the exit briefing, that's when you're all through with your survey and everybody's sitting down in their suits and nodding back and forth, and he's worried about what you're going to tell him, and you've got all your documents with you and everything. At the exit briefing, we're all through, we're saying, oh, thank you very much, thank you very much. And this one project manager that was sitting at the table says, excuse me, but I have a question. Yes, what is it? What is it? And he slides the book Mind Reach across the table and says, what are we supposed to do about this? Now, this was a turn of events that was very interesting because not only had I brought this up in my command, but now we had an official question from an official command saying, what do we do about this? So I took that question back to Major Keenan. Here I am, a young lieutenant, strapping lieutenant. I wasn't great in fact then. And I said, sir, we have a request from Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, asking us how are they supposed to protect themselves from the remote viewing threat? And the major turned back to me and said, Lieutenant, what are you going to do about that? I said to him, sir, we need to demonstrate, first of all, whether this is really a genuine threat. And he said, okay, Lieutenant, how are you going to do that? And I said, well, sir, I'm going to have to check into this a little bit more and I'll get back with you. He said, okay. So I spent some time finding out about the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, who wrote these classified documents that we had. And then I went to DIA and found a guy named Jim Sawyer, who was kind of running things at the Defense Intelligence Agency then. And I thought, you know, if this big shot from the Defense Intelligence Agency were to brief Major Keenan, then maybe it would be better than this young lieutenant briefing Major Keenan. So I made an arrangement for Jim Sawyer to come up and talk to Major Keenan about the threat. And it convinced him. And so that day when Jim Sawyer left and walked down the hall, Major Keenan says, Lieutenant, get in my office right now. And I go into his office and he said, so what are you going to do about this, Lieutenant? I said, well, you know, sir, what we need to do is to include this in our service. This is more than a problem just for Redstone Arsenal, Alabama. If this is, in fact, a threat to our security, this is something that we ought to incorporate in the service that we do for these other military facilities. Okay, Lieutenant, how are you going to do that? I'm like, well, sir, out at SRI, sir, they use civilians. They have various and sundry contract psychics that they have to do this. But I don't think it'd be very good to use them, sir, because they don't have security clearances and they're involved working in a relationship with a private contractor. You know, sir, what we really need to do is we really need to have some people like here in the office, professional intelligence people. Yeah, that's a good idea, sir. We need to train some people to do this. So I thought that was a pretty outlandish suggestion, you know. And I thought that he was going to say, Lieutenant, go do something else. You know, don't bother me anymore. But what did he say? He said, how are you going to do that, Lieutenant? So it's all history now, right? I said, sir, I'll have to get back to you on that. And I went out and visited Russ and Hal, tried to figure out what I was doing, what I was going to say next time. The major turned to me and said, what are you going to do about that, Lieutenant? So this is going to be the story of what I did about that. But let's take ourselves again 23 years back in time. I might not do the same things today, but this is what I did 23 years ago. Come on, we should work 50 ago.
26 years ago.
I was going to show a movie here, but we're going to change it. Okay. I was eventually appointed the operations and training officer of this unit that was formed, and I was there for 10 years. This is the operations officer definition of what that means. And that's the training officer definition of what that means. And I was also incorporated into a program called Great Skills, so that I was able to stay on station at the permanent place and not go through the usual career progressions of getting so many assignments and getting a command and so forth and so on. There's a special program within intelligence where they can take people and promote them along with their peers, but they don't have to go through all the appropriate assignments because you're kind of locked into doing that thing for your career. So I was incorporated into that program. Now, in terms of finding out, here's this young lieutenant going out and saying, how are you going to do this, Lieutenant? How are you going to train these officers to become remote viewing specialists? Well, I visited Russ and Hal at SRI, and they basically were interested in the idea of training, although they liked to use the words of screening or testing or checking remote viewing ability rather than training someone to do remote viewing. They told me that when they worked with people that they asked them to sketch what they perceived and maybe mention groups of words, 2 or 3 words about what that is. Not big long sentences, but groups of words about what that might be. they did not feel, when I pestered them, I said, so what's the psychological profile of a good remote viewer? And what is the best way in which they do that? You know, should they stand on their heads while they do that, or should they sit down in a chair when they should do that? Should they lay down when they do it? And they didn't have any particular answers for me. They said, well, we let people do whatever works best for them. As a matter of fact, I understand Hella had some remote viewing socks she liked to wear, and Pat Price had a pair of glasses, and he would put them on to be able to see, and then you take them off and sketch, and you put them on to be able to see. Whatever happened to those glasses, Russ? They probably were pretty good. Now, there was another opinion that I found in looking at the background, and we heard about that with the Gansfield experiments. The Gansfield concept was that this psychic signal, this remote viewing signal, was very quiet and very soft, and it was the noise of our brains and our daily activity that kind of kept us from perceiving these things. And if we could quiet that input, that thinking process, that maybe this quiet psychic signal would emerge. And this was sort of another opinion from a different lab that wasn't being looked at in the protocol. It's supposed to change when they place this. Now, I thought this was an interesting idea. They had a thing called the Gansfield technique, and we had that explained to us the other day about how you put the ping pong balls over your eyes and you play the hissing sound in there, kind of flooding the senses with nothingness, hoping that out of that you would emerge some sort of a psychic signal. And it seems to work. I mean, the data is really tremendous. Did it work? I see the little light flash back at me, and I assumed it worked, but maybe the light flashing back says I didn't work. Now, to me, this idea of doing some sort of practice that would quiet your mind first before you try to get the psychic information seemed sort of logical to me. That seemed appropriate. And again, when I was out at SRI 23 years ago, they didn't offer me any magic formula. They said, well, we just let the people do what they want to do. Some people do lay down. Some people do stand on their heads. Some people do have their magic socks that help them remote view. Whatever works is what we support within that individual. And that was a valuable thing too, because in the years to come, I was going to find lots of people who wanted to do lots of different things. And I wasn't supposed to say, you can't do that, that won't make you remote view. The idea was to encourage whatever worked within people. Now, I already had my own experiences with something you might call remote viewing. Throughout my childhood, I had very interesting kinds of experiences, especially dealing with automobiles. When I got my first car at 15 years old, I found that I was able to see things mechanically. I knew right where something was wrong, and then you take the whole car apart and fix it and put it back together. And I actually thought that that's what a mechanic was, that when you took your car to a mechanic, that's the way he knew what was wrong with your car. I mean, how else could he know what was wrong with your car? It was a very complicated machine. Well, I learned later, working for some not-so-good mechanics, that that isn't what they did. Now, in examining, in self-examination, trying to come up with some sort of a how am I going to do these guys, I kind of took what Russ and Howlett told me. I took what I learned from the Honorton work, others, and my own experience. And that experience was also, to me, kind of a two-phase experience. I'd be like involved and absorbed in the intuitive process, and then there was sort of a second level experience where I became aware of what I was doing. But those were two distinct experiences. One being so deeply involved in it, and then the other one being aware that I was involved in, sort of two levels. So I kind of took that idea, that concept, into development too. So based on, the work at SRI, where I visited with them personally, stuff I read, Schwartz's stuff about psychic archaeology, although we didn't approach him directly, was fascinating to read that there were other people that could actually do this and they were using it for psychic archaeology. It helped me certainly to convince my bosses that this was a real phenomenon. We came up with a generic framework. I came up with a generic framework to go back to Major Keenan and said, sir, this is how we're going to do it. So the mission was, of course, in this military training, to be able to develop a cadre of remote viewers who were able to attack U.S. installations, U.S. Army installations all over the world, using remote viewing to assess their vulnerability to hostile intelligence agencies doing the same thing, the same way. So that was our mission, and we wanted to find out whether or not we were going to be able to help people protect themselves from this. So I took from my knowledge, picked up at SRI, my reading, my own personal background, went before Major Keenan and said, this is what we're going to do. And I sort of took a behaviorist approach to this thing. I had an educational background in psychology, and it seemed to me that all learned behaviors could be reduced into little increments, and then all you needed to do was train those increments, and together they would create an overall behavior. And of course, I, 23 years ago, was guessing that these might be the behaviors that would be appropriate. So, did it change? How about that? Okay, the first of these behaviors has to do with getting into some sort of an interior state. Now, in other Army training, we were taught to search the field in front of us. There we are with our M16s, searching for the enemy. And you search for the enemy in front of you by dividing the scene up into segments and scanning your eyes back and forth, repeatedly doing that. Very trainable, acquired skill. But it says what is to be detected and action taken upon is out there. We can't do that in remote viewing, and it would seem then that the perceptions come from within, not from without. So we have to have some sort of a way to understand that things come from within in remote viewing, not from without. You can't train people to scan the remote viewing horizon and see what you pick up. There's no horizon inside. Now, this reorientation to thinking can be stimulated by various and sundry different behaviors that you can train or adapt to for other people. Getting into this mental state of quietness, of interior, of introspection. And there are lots of different methods. Breathing kinds of things, posture kinds of things. There are people that train different eye methods for these kinds of things. It's a different state of consciousness. It is a letting go of the outside input to your senses and turning inward to those interior worlds. Sometimes you can't force this to happen. It's something that you have to let happen. I need to put one more slide in here, which I don't have, which is a joke from my favorite humorist, Ashley Brilliant. And in that joke, it has a guy laying on a cot, and he has ropes tied around his ankles and his right hand. And the ropes go under the bed, and with his left hand, he's pulling as hard as he can on these ropes. And the caption is, "Force yourself to relax." So this idea of training some sort of behavior of letting go becomes a challenge, It's somewhat like Russ was saying in the transcendent experience. That you can you explain to me this experience you're having? No, it's beyond words. Good. Now teach other people that, you know, and it's the same kind of thing. You can't force yourself to relax, but there are certain kinds of things you can do to promote that. Once obtained, this feeling of relaxation moves you kind of into a different kind of a space. You aren't as aware of the things going on in the room around you, and your sense of who and what and where you are changes. You kind of redefine yourself, which is exactly where we're going. That's kind of exactly what we want to happen. Your sense of your personal space disappears. It changed, okay. This calmness replaces the cacophony of the outside world, and that kind of goes along with what Honorton and the others were trying to say. Maybe this quiet interior state will allow the remote viewing information to emerge because it won't be overshadowed by this exterior noise. So getting into this quiet space is important. This, on point 2 here, many of you will be familiar with the many variations of Ingo Swann's method, the idea of kinesthetic responses to the initial input. This is very common. You know, the ideogram thing that you do, this kinesthetic kind of a response to this interior knowing. In leaning back more to a meditative side of the house, these same states are identified by the brainwave and meditative people as borderline states of consciousness or twilight states of consciousness, maybe a theta stage 2 sleep kind of consciousness here too, hypnagogic kinds of things. So there is a broad kind of scope between the legacy that Ingo has left us in terms of pay attention to the kinesthetic things happening in your body, as well as the meditative and brainwave people and how they measure things. Now, this letting go and turning inward is when it becomes a behavior that you learn, it becomes something that you're aware of. You kind of know when that takes place. First you train it, and then people become aware of, oh, that's what it's like, and then you can recapture that. You become aware of it. You can, once you know that, you can tweak it and maintain it and perpetuate it. Know when you fall out of it, and then move back into it and stay in that space. Now, teaching this is not too hard because you're not teaching anybody remote viewing at this point. You're only teaching them how to find this quiet interior focus. And there's lots of literature on this, lots of different practices from, you know, TM to yoga to Monroe Institute, all these kinds of things about getting into this interior space. So what I did then in the training program was I set up programs for the student remote viewers to practice these kinds of things. Go out and read this literature, try out yoga, try out TM, try out Monroe. See what works for you so that you can get into this interior space. And I, of course, tried to school myself in those things so I could sit with them and talk intelligently about what they were experiencing. So each one of them had their own particular method, the target of which was to get into this interior space. Now, once they captured that as a behavioral skill, I moved on to the next skill, which was that of connecting with the target. You know, you're given a cue and you've got to connect with it. And notice here how I have said information of interest. That was kind of a difference between operational remote viewing and many of the remote viewing tasks that we usually think about. I always held in my mind that the real target was the information of interest. For example, in a security mission using remote viewing, we might ask a remote viewer to tell me whether or not the B-2 bomber in the hangar is armed. Okay? And I give him the set of coordinates. Now, the coordinates relate to the location of the airport or location of the hangars. And he might come back and describe an airport and a hangar and get, quote, a one-to-one match and a statistical miracle and all this. But it didn't provide me with the information of interest. So I always carried in my thinking, when I gave him the coordinate, I need you to tell me whether or not there are bombs on that B-2 bomber or not. Is it armed? Is it a nuclear-armed B-2 bomber ready to go, or isn't it? So that's why you'll see in my slides information of interest. Now, remote viewers can tell you a very interesting number of things. Much more than I ever thought from reading the original Mind Breach. You just have to think clever ways to ask questions. I'll tell you a little war story in conjunction with this. We were tracking a spy, an agent, to determine whether or not he made his drop and switched his suitcase of money for the material he was supposed to get back. And it was in a square, a town square in a foreign country, and we were back at Fort Meade doing remote viewing. And I put the remote viewer on the target, and we had to find out whether it was the right date and everything. He didn't know what he was there for. I just gave him the coordinates of the square. He went to the square, said, gee, I'm in the middle of this town square. And I said, okay, tell me about the weather, you know. What time of day is it? What's going on? And in an attempt to find out whether I was at a proper date to expect Mr. Spy with a suitcase to come walking through, I thought, I know, I'll have him find somebody reading a newspaper and look over his shoulder and tell me the date on the newspaper. And so I said, describe what's going on in the square. And said, oh, well, there are people having coffee, there's people reading, there's a guy over there. I said, we'll go over to the guy reading and describe what he's reading. He's reading a newspaper. All right. Stand behind him, look over his shoulder, and tell me what the newspaper says. I can't, it's in German. And I'm like, I understand. If it were in English, describe what the newspaper says. Oh, well, it says, da, 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 da. So, they can tell you an amazing amount of things. You just have to be clever enough to think of the questions to ask. So not only can they tell you, about particular objects and things, sometimes they can tell you about, health issues and technical dilemmas, lots of interesting things. When you're sure they're having a good day, when you're sure they're on target, it's just your inventiveness of what kind of questions you might want to ask them, and thinking there are no limitations. There simply are no limitations. Now, what's this one? People are different. Okay? This connecting behavior, this connect with the target, people do it differently. People have their own philosophic outlook on the world, on how remote viewing works, and how they connect and resonate with the target. And you don't try to convince them they're wrong. Okay? You go with their philosophy, you learn about that philosophy, and when you talk to them, you feed back that philosophy to them so that it reinforces their own belief system. Now, some think about bringing this information into their own mental space. Others see themselves extending across distance to that other place. Well, remember what Russell said, there is no distance. I mean, it's all one, no space, time, and all that. But you don't sit down and argue with the remote viewer about that, You say, okay, move your consciousness 3,000 kilometers west, and you let him go with, that's the way you do it. Button push, movie. Okay. Other viewers kind of see themselves more in line with what Russell was talking about, that they just kind of harmonize, they kind of just tune into. They don't perceive this as being something a long ways away in space or time. They just sort of resonate with and become aware of this information. How do you teach people to do this? You have to respect their own social psychological conditioning, their own beliefs about what this is, and reinforce them that are working. Don't try to convince them, no, that's the way the universe works. You don't understand. You know, you have to sit down and cross your legs and meditate to do this. You can't sit at a table and do this. It won't work that way. You have to kind of reinforce where they're coming from, reinforce the behaviors that work, get them to trust in themselves and their own processes. Let's talk about how you might teach a kid, how you might introduce a kid to playing soccer, to connecting with a soccer ball. What are the ways you would go through teaching him to connect with a soccer ball, with a brand new kind of behavior to learn? Well, first you might, let him play with the ball for a while and reward him when he does a good job with it. You might, suggest to him, point your toe a little bit more, bend at the knees when you do it. But you don't criticize him so much that, no, I told you to bend your knees, now stop that. Each time you see him do a good behavior and you do that, you might offer a few little pointers or suggestions that from past performance, are going to work really well. But you use a performance-oriented thing. Then, once he's, got a good feel for the ball, he knows it's not going to hurt when he kicks it near him, then you step away from him and you kind of roll the ball to him. Okay? Now try it. You roll the ball to him and you get him a little more confident in his behavior and he remembers things he did correctly in the past and whoa, you really got it that time. That was really gay. There, try another. Whoa, look at that. You really got it that time. So there is this job of coaching. So maybe a remote viewing trainer is more of a coach than he is a trainer. You were on a trip 23 years ago now. Okay, remember that. Maybe it's a coach more than a trainer. And you present to the guy learning to play soccer a variety of opportunities to actually connect with the ball. If he misses it, you roll him another ball. If he misses it, you roll him another ball. You give him a lot of opportunities to do this connecting. Now this kind of one-on-one first-person experience this young man has with connecting with the ball, with contacting the ball, is built upon his previous experience. Just like Charlie Tart was telling us last night in this learning kind of a situation. That worked really well when I did that. I'll do that next time. So he builds up this repertoire of experience that helps him contact or connect with the ball more and more. Okay? Now, what kind of strategies can he have in his mind? There's all sorts of training tools now in virtual reality. And it is said that your body doesn't need to do something to react to it. I mean, when you have dreams, your body isn't acting it out, but if we hook physiological monitors up to you, it looks like it is. So imagining things in your mind is one of the things they do in sports. Imagining yourself doing this, imagining yourself doing that. We're obviously going to transfer this all to remote viewing in a minute, okay? But in the case of the guy learning to play soccer, this kid is imagining what it might be like. Is he imagining the ball sailing way off into the distance, what kinds of things is he rehearsing in his head while this is going on? Now, how about taking this whole kind of ball of knowledge about training, contact with the information of interest, and moving it over into the remote viewing arena? How do you do this? Well, just like with the soccer ball situation, you move in small increments. You start out with easier things and move more and more separated from what is really easy to do or what makes sense in your mind when you think about it. So the original SRI protocol worked really well for this initial kind of a concept. You get locked up in a room with Russell, and somebody goes out to the target site, whether it be a fountain, a laundromat, a swimming pool system, you're locked in the room with Russell and he's encouraging you to sketch and draw and say 2 or 3 words about what you perceive and which perceptions you have more that you have more confidence in. And then you go out afterwards to actually look at the site and say, oh, this doesn't look anything like what I wrote. Or you say, there's the water over there, and look, there's that big tall thing I drew. Look at all the X's on that wall over there. It works in the same way, and it's kind of easy for you to imagine in your mind what's that like, because you're going to do this once a day for 5, 6 days, a couple weeks, something like that, and you get to the point where it's sort of easy to understand. This makes sense. You know, it isn't too hard. I'm just going to describe where it's going to go in a little bit. And you can imagine, you know, yourself seeing through the eyes of the person there. Sometimes the radio or TV shows that Joe McMoneagle does, they talk about it that way. And Joe McMoneagle will see through the eyes of the person that, you know, just, okay. But the methodology that the remote viewer feels that they're doing is something you want to, you know, be aware of. Another connecting experience that you can do to encourage somebody that's, you know, kind of a little different than that is to put pictures in a sealed envelope. You know, it's not too hard of a thing to think about. Oh, that picture in that envelope right across the table there, that's what I'm supposed to remote view. Okay, that's too hard to do, you know. It's just impossible, but it isn't too hard to do, you know what I mean? The picture's right over there. I got to be able to do that just fine. So it's a little bit different of a problem. You're going to interact with the target less because it's just a picture. On the other hand, it seems to be pretty interesting to do. And then, just like in teaching the kid how to play soccer, you know, you step back and you roll the ball to him. Now you take it a little bit further away and you start giving him geographic coordinates. And the remote viewer says, you want me to do what? How am I supposed to tell you what's at, you know, 37 degrees north, 14 degrees west, you know? I haven't got a clue. And so he said, well, you know, you told me where Dr. Putoff went when he was out there and you didn't know about that, and you described this picture in this envelope. Yeah, but that's different. No, it's not so different. Because after you describe this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture of what's at the other end of those coordinates. That picture is here in the room with us right now. You need to describe these coordinates. So you are, again, making the problem a little bit more interesting, separating the distance out, and doing many, many of these to build up the confidence, just like you do many, many, many kicks with a soccer player till he builds up the confidence, till he knows exactly what he's doing. Now, when he's out there on the field chasing the ball and kicking, the coach isn't there all the time. Sometimes they're there, bend your knees, remember to do this. Most of the time you're out there on your own, and you don't need that direct interface, and that's what happens in remote viewing. After you find these things in learning, you move on and deal with it. So, contacting them with the information of interest, the teacher, coach, me in this case, simply reinforce those kinds of connected behaviors that produce results, hoping for a learning response. Let's then move on to the third behavior. The third behavior. First, you're going to learn to quiet your mind. Then you're going to connect with the target. But then you're going to listen. You're going to listen to what's going on. You're going to listen to the information inside that interior space. Just observe. Just listen. What is listening all about? Well, you got into that quiet space, and now you're cued to connect with the target, and now you just listen. You aren't even necessarily aware of anything. You're just listening. This information that the remote viewer is going to get usually emerges from habit, the way we perceive the rest of the world around us. Our ability to process information inside of the wetware inside our head here, and the way our mental interface works with that is habitual. You know? It's a kind of acting out process. Last time I saw this as a picture, it worked fine. Last time I heard this, it worked fine. So our first attempt at listening, and I don't necessarily mean ears, I just simply mean turning inward, we start to have our senses try to talk to us. Yeah, it's bright, it's red, it's colorful, it's this and it's that. Yeah. But at this point, we just listen, knowing that those habitual things are going to come up. Each viewer is going to be different, because we're different human beings. And all of you know about this technology. You know, are you oriented towards sight, towards vision, towards kinesthetic responses? Each remote viewer is going to have a different way of interacting with the world. You know, I see what you mean, I hear what you say, I feel it. You know, everybody responds and reacts to the world differently, so respect that in their experience. This remote viewer's attention is a very interesting focus of attention because it's internal, not external, and it can be panoramic or not. Remember in Greg's situation, people said, well, I only got the guy on the ladder. I didn't get the big building. That's okay. You know, where your focus is can be panoramic or not, but it's a little bit different than focused attention. In focused attention, you shut out everything else around and pay direct attention to that, focusing your attention. But in remote viewing, it's like you're aware of all things all at one time. So it's not focused and narrow and excluding. It's waiting patiently, this listening stage, okay? Relax, turn inward, listen. This listening stage is receptive, without expectations. You know, so you can't have this internal mind chatter, right? I got 3 swimming pools already. I bet it's not a swimming pool this time. You know? This is not what's supposed to be going on. This is quiet listening that's going on. Okay, how do you train this? How do you put people through these experiences of listening so that they learn what this feels like? This listening is not reporting. Okay, this listening is not like, I sense this, I feel this, I hear this. This is happening before that. This is just the listening here. He's not expected to talk about that. So, in coaching this experience here, how do you listen once you have contact with the site? You ask the viewer to describe what's going on with them. And listen very carefully to what they tell you. If they start talking about the site, you say back to them, I'm not interested in what I want to know. I want to know what's going on with you. Describe your mental activity, what's happening. And once they, because you're trying to teach them how to be aware of self-listening. Okay? At this point, you're trying to teach them how to become aware of self-listening. So you get them to talk about that. You might even get them to write some things down. They might, you know, rights and things, but not about the site, about themselves, because they have to become aware of listening. In my behavioristic view, 23 years ago, you had to move through these steps in order sequentially. You had to first quiet yourself. You had to then contact the target. You had to then listen to your interior perceptions. Now, the fourth thing in this system is actually becoming aware. Now that you get to the fourth one, it kind of makes sense. You know, how are you going to become aware if you didn't listen first, right? But listening is distinctly separate from becoming aware. Now, in thinking about this point in time, I'm aware, and we have to pull that moment apart a little bit in terms of human behavior terms, pull that apart and talk about it in terms of just before, during, and just after. So we're going to pull that moment of awareness apart and talk about just before awareness, what happens during awareness, and then what happens just after awareness. So there you are in stage 2. You're listening to your internal processes. You're just listening. You're not necessarily aware of anything, you're just listening. And there is a magical point at which you forget that you're confined to your body. You forget who, what, and where you are. You're about to become aware of the target. That falls away ever so briefly. Your orientation then becomes focused on, is it cheap? That little red light flashing. Your orientation then becomes what? A bright flash, vertical lines, the color red. Whatever your awareness comes, it comes just after that feeling of, oh wow, kind of last letting go, this last ego connection with here I am doing this right now suddenly dissolves away and you're into this awareness click. Now, in practical terms, you shift back and forth. You shift back to listening, then you become aware, and then you shift back to listening, and you become aware. The way I'm talking about it, it's like it's one big giant stream. You know, because you've experienced it, it shifts back and forth. Now, how about this situation? Remember, we're going to stretch this point apart here. What about this? We talked about the moment just before. Now we're going to the moment of awareness here. And this information can appear to you in several different forms. It can appear in your senses, in your stage 2s, for people who do stage 2s. There is sometimes a sense of surety about the perceptions. It is not a guessing experiment. Is it red or is it blue? Let's say blue this time. Last time I said it was red. There is a sense of surety about your perceptions that come crisp and immediate. Now, you need to be, it seemed to me 23 years ago that you needed to be passive in this, that you couldn't say to yourself, I wonder if there's a car around the corner of the building, and click remote viewing wise around the building, because that active kind of thing was a delicate mental mechanism, then you might in fact create an image of the car. The monitor, the trainer, might say to you, more simply describe what's in back of the building, rather than go see if there's a car in back of the building, right? So you have to be passive in your receiving of the information. And that's a very interesting state because it isn't necessarily the way we operate in our one-on-one physical world. If I want to know what's in the other room over there, I take some action, active value into go find out what's in that other room over there. It's kind of an active sort of a thing. But this whole level seemed to me 23 years ago to be rather passive. You have to set aside all those preconceived notions about what might be there, what you might remote view at the target. Again, this very strange sensation or feeling, the loss of personal identity and ego, the I am somehow the site of interest, rather than me looking at the site of interest. There's some peculiar kind of a shift of awareness there beyond our normal ego state. Are you going to know the meaning of everything you perceive at this point? No. As a matter of fact, if you think you do, you're probably jumping to some conclusion that's erroneous, because this is supposed to be a passive, receptive state. Your first awareness is kind of vague and indistinct, usually, only a piece or part of what's going on there. And yet we know the information is there. Okay? Remember, Russell talked about experiments where, although people didn't consciously report things, you look at their physiology and you knew it was there. Remember Charlie talking about, okay, you're supposed to guess when I'm sending you a signal. And Charlie said you couldn't, they were just guessing by random. But if you looked at their physiology, they knew when he was getting the electroshock. Okay? So we assume that the remote viewing is there, that you know this. This is the way I, coached and trained McMonagle. He would say, well, I don't know. And I said, Joe, we talked about this. You do know, you're just not aware of it yet. You know everything there is you need on this target. You know that. Let's figure out how to bring it into your awareness. So he went in with his confidence, and he never doesn't know a target. It's just the exercise of bringing it into awareness. There's some experimental evidence that shows we're all connected. We always know this already. The target that you're personally going to remote view is 2 months from now. You know that in this moment. 2 months from now, you bring it into awareness. Now, we talked about the moment just before awareness. We talked about what happens during the awareness. And how about that little piece of time just after you're aware? What is your behavior? Remember, I'm doing this 23 years ago as a behaviorist. What is your behavior just after you become aware? Well, you can repress the sensation. Let's say you get the image of a rose. That can't be a rose. I remember yesterday was my anniversary and I gave my wife roses, so I'll just dismiss that perception. We'll throw that one away. I can deny it, right? Alternatively, you can grab onto that and you can say, yeah, a rose, yeah, I know what that means. And that means, the roses, that means love. Yeah, this target has something to do with love. That's what this is all about. So you can grab onto that. Worse yet, the remote viewer can seek to recognize and name the target. I see large yellow arches. McDonald's, yeah, McDonald's, that's what it is. Large yellow arches, McDonald's, right? So this is those brief mental moments, but a behavior, those brief mental behaviors just after awareness. All of these things, all of these concepts have to do with bollocksing up the system. When I found this on Microsoft, I thought, well, that's a really good symbol of what's going on here. All of these kinds of things, right after the awareness mode, bollocks up the system here. So, what do we really want to happen. What we really want to happen is that you just let it come in. Just let it come in without trying to figure it out, without attaching it to anything, without trying to name the target, but you just let it build up and flow in and accumulate and blossom of its own accord. So how do you train someone to do this, right? Again, it's a matter of becoming aware of the individual processes. The person, the trainee, has to learn what's going on in his own mind. He has to discipline himself. He has to not run off making these mistakes. You have to encourage this through lessons. Let me tell you a story about Joe McMonagle and one of the viewings he did out at SRI. Probably this relates directly to Russell's ideal coaching with him. He was on a target, and the first thing he said was, well, this is a beach. It's a beach. And Russell said, well, what is it, Joe? It makes you say it's a beach. And he said, well, it's a beach. And I'm sure it is. It's a beach. And Russell said, well, do you hear the ocean? Smell the ocean? No. Do you see people there having fun in bathing suits? No. Well, Joe, tell me what it is you perceive at the target. Sand. I perceive sand at the target. Okay, fine. Well, when they went out to the site, drove out the site, it was a brickyard with a big giant pile of sand. Okay. So it's that kind of a learning experience that taught Joe not to do all those other things, to jump to conclusions, to try to identify what the target is. Just say back to Russell, I perceive sand. Rather than, this is a beach, yeah, it's a beach and all. Yeah, it could be this, and look at all that, you know. Like you haven't done that yourself. Now, the best way to train this is to have people write down about their mental processes. The act of writing itself kind of slows down and makes you think deliberately about what was going on. And then I, as the monitor, would look at that and ask questions about that. And ask them, do they think that that helps them in realizing the target, in becoming aware of the target, in these three things, this just before awareness, the during awareness phase, and just after awareness, the kinds of things that they can group up with just after awareness. Now, during these writings, they're not supposed to be writing about the target. So if we were to ask Joe to write an essay about this adventure with Russell of the sand pile off the beach, we wouldn't want Joe to describe about the target. We would want him to describe in his writings, what was the mental process that you went through, Joe? Describe your thinking about how did you come up by saying beach. Well, I was perceiving this gritty stuff, and then I thought, well, when was the last time I felt this gritty stuff? And it was when I was standing at the beach, and I began to think about being at the beach in Miami when I grew up, and that made me think that, well, just for sure, this must be the beach. Yeah, I mean, we're here in Northern California, they have beaches. I bet the target is the beach. And so you get him to write down all of that thinking process so that he can pull it apart later and find out how it was faulty. But if he never declares it out, if he never tells you, his trainer or his monitor, what went on in his head, if he never self-examines, he can't make corrective ways of behaving. 23 years ago as a behavior. Now, this becoming aware then is an allowing process. The remote viewer should let the inklings assemble themselves. He doesn't have to try to make sense out of this. They will assemble themselves. Vague impressions resolve themselves. Now, in the Ingo Swan technique, where you put your pencil back on top of your sketch, your ideogram, that helps it resolve itself. And each time you touch that, the kinesthetic cue to bring back more information about the site. So things resolve themselves. You don't have to be analytically asking yourself questions about it. This point of being aware is not the reporting yet. That's the next behavior. This point of becoming aware is not objectifying, of saying out of declaring what you perceive. It's a matter of letting it resolve in your own head. In Ingo's method, it wouldn't be even writing it down, because that's objectifying. It's those moments that are occurring before you objectify. Which brings us to the fifth behavior. Again, as a behaviorist, I thought things ought to be divided up into, quieting your mind and relaxing into listening. That's cueing or acquiring the target, listening to your internal perceptions. Then you become aware, and then you declare out or write down or objectify what it is you perceive. Now, what are some of the training behaviors you can do to do this? Ingo Swann and all of you in CRV have a very structured kind of thing, a very deliberate system for objectifying things out. Ingo Swann came up, I think, he maybe got this from Collier or somebody else, but the idea of objecting is to bring it out of mental space. All this time, all these behaviors we've been talking about are mental behaviors. So objectifying is the first time when you bring it out of the mental world into the physical world, in terms of saying or writing what it is that's been going on with you. And notice how I say in past tense verb what it is that's been going on with you. Because in my particular perspective 23 years ago, I was thinking about this as being kind of two distinct arenas. The perception arena and the talking about it arena, or a type 1 experience and a type 2 experience, in dealing with that in two different ways. Sometimes this is the most difficult task for the remote viewer because of the habits that they have. Ideally speaking, if the remote viewer reports pure information, only just pure perceptions, it can be really beautiful. It can be very meaningful. It's when it gets attached to all the other garbage that we have to figure things out and use scoring, and it isn't quite so obvious about how well it's connected with the site. Or the information of interest. He has to suspend his judgments and his preconceived notions so that he objectifies, he brings out into the objective world the mental space. And this can be really tricky, because that's where everything in our habits, everything in our thinking pattern is to make sense out of what we're perceiving. I mean, how am I going to walk across here if I don't make sense of what I'm perceiving? It's just not going to work. Everything that we've learned from toddlers on is to make sense of and categorize everything that we are perceiving in this unreal, physical, time-space world. Now, this can be then the most difficult thing, to unlearn those habits. An experienced interviewer can be very helpful in this process in distinguishing between two behaviors. Remember 23 years ago I thought these were two kinds of behaviors. You were doing remote viewing, that was one behavior, and you were telling me about it, that was the other behavior. Okay? So an experienced interviewer can be really helpful in this objectifying experience, because the interviewer knows in his heart, so to speak, that the remote viewer knows everything about this target. There's nothing this remote viewer doesn't know about that target. The trick is to get them to become aware of it, to be skillful enough to allow them to learn how to become aware of what they know. Okay? So you can see from the onset, my own belief system was, well, of course remote viewing works, it's not a problem. course they know everything there is to know about the target. All we have to do is get them to become aware of it. So it was a nice belief system to work out. In my experience of working with dozens of remote viewers over thousands of sessions, there are lots of different little behaviors that gave me clues as to whether they were connected with a target and reporting valid information, or whether they were attaching analysis and judgment to it, or rambling on and on. And Russell himself saw thousands of remote viewings and dozens of remote viewers and began to adapt himself to watch this. And some of these unconscious kinds of behaviors didn't change. Okay. Are seen by the interviewer because the interviewer himself has had some sort of remote viewing experience. He has an appreciation for the difficulty. Remember we talk about focused attention. I'm right here looking at you and I'm reading your name. That's focused attention. In remote viewing, there's this awareness of everything all at once, all at the same time. The interviewer has to appreciate that and try to emerge this person's name on their name tag out of the total awareness of the entire target site at the time. Working within that appreciation then, the roles of the interviewer and the viewer intertwine. They become a team effort to extract the information of interest. There's no question that it's already known. The question is to bring it to awareness and objectify it. Now, the remote viewer, as I've been saying, knows more than they suppose they know. So the skilled interviewer, with a mindset of knowing that, believing it, I know that you know everything about this target. I just have to figure out how to get you to tell me about it. Okay? What are some of the little behaviors? One of these slides I talk about posing questions that elicit different kinds of information. Some behavior, did that change? Okay. Different subtle behaviors. If you're talking to the interviewer and he looks off into the distance for a moment, you know something has happened. He's gone back to look at the information. Whereas if he still maintains eye contact, says, well, I don't know, it might be in green, it might have been red, I don't know. But if he goes green, well then you have an idea that he's recontacted the site. He can change different body positions. He can use different language, move to present tense reporting as opposed to past tense conditional subjective reporting. Yep. Okay. In my thinking, 23 years ago, I believed that when the remote viewer was telling me something, he was back here in the room with me and not at the site. And so that one behavior would subordinate the other. And so in the way we worked with the people and the way we trained the people, they were considered distinct things. Moving from being on site or being back here telling me about it. Now, philosophically, that doesn't make too much sense because we are everywhere all at the same time. But 23 years ago, in terms of looking at it from a behavioristic standpoint, that's the way I felt about it. And that coming back and talking to me about the site was different than actually viewing the site. You're doing delicate balance between the first and second case. Now this I tell people now at the Monroe Institute, when I've had them in the isolation booth and they're in the middle of an experience and I talk to them, they say, oh, I can't talk to you while I'm out of my body. You know, that'll stop it happening. And I asked them to remember back when they were 15 or 16 years old and they first began to drive a car. And you're driving along and you're looking at everything in the rearview mirror, checking the rearview mirror, how am I going, am I in the middle of the road and everything. You have all this stuff to pay attention to, and it's just terrible. And then someone talks to you and the seat next to you and everything collapses and you can't pay attention and so forth and so on. But now, as adults, you can drive down the street, you can listen to the radio, you know, and talk to your friends. All this other stuff just goes on automatically. Hey, you can juggle, you can chew gum and walk at the same time, you know. So, it would seem to me that it is possible that you can find this balance. You can kind of be on site, you can actually be doing the remote viewing, being there, observing, and talking about it at the same time. It's the job of the monitor then to encourage that to happen, because if he drifts back away from the site and starts talking and objectifying, that's ripe territory for embellishment, analytical overlay, filling in, all those kinds of things. But yet you can get him to talk in present tense active voice about the site that he is actually observing while he's talking to you and objectifying, then you get much more accurate data. Change. Again, talking about the first case experience versus the second case experience. I'm going to go around to this. Good. So, this is what I talked about before, little micro behaviors that you can watch for. You're sitting there working with monitor, things that monitor works for to try to draw information out of you. Remember in the ARV sessions that Greg talked about, it was kind of a self-control thing and you did it all yourself? I might restructure that and put a monitor in the room and try to push up the value of each one of those viewings so we didn't have as many ones or twos, we have a whole lot more 3s, 4s, and 5s. By having the interviewer interact and watch for little behaviors that would happen and encourage perceptions about the target that were appropriate, and then have the interviewer do the judging about what was being described by your viewer at this moment. One of the very telltale characteristics is slowing down the speech pattern. It's like Windows systems co-processing. You know, when your printer tries to do something while you're running another program, it really slows down. It's like a co-processing system. When your speech patterns slow down, it's as though there is a contact with the site and the words leak out in between these brief flashes or moments. And I'm saying that's exactly how it happens, or physiologically how it happens, or it's as though it happens that way. But there's really a characteristic of the slowing of the speech pattern. So as an interviewer, then, that's what I would watch for, you know, and I'd listen, and I'd put a little check mark, meaning this is a slow speech pattern. Pay attention to what he's saying at this point. Enhancing the tape, the quality of the information of interest that we're extracting from this site. Many of you have done this yourself, and it's when I would put a little check mark saying, watch this is a slowed speech situation, when you see in a transcript, this is just like the brick schoolhouse where I went to school. What's that? That's a conditional kind of comparator statement. So is the guy remote viewing a brick schoolhouse? No, but there might be the color red there, or there might be bricks there, or it might be a school there. You know, what is it that triggered this kind of a statement? So watch for metaphors, similes, conditional statements that are said. It's an indication of the viewer's processes, and it is the role of the monitor to pay attention to that, because he's watching the in the behaviorist model. He's watching the behavior of the remote viewer. That's me? I had to take a drink of water to get this over. I'm waiting for somebody to ask what is an Ericksonian style of questioning. In my head, when I was fantasizing about giving this talk, I was hoping that question would come up and then I would be a real smart ass and answer the question, which was some sort of Ericksonian question, and the rest of the audience would typically kick out. Obviously, the monitor's job is not to introduce information into the session. It's okay to mirror back things he said. For example, the viewer comes and says, large, tall, glass structure, and the monitor would be permitted to say, tell me more about the large, tall, glass structure. The monitor would not be permitted to say, tell me about the Empire State Building some more. So the idea is to not introduce information that the viewer has to sift through and identify, but you can certainly mirror back things that have already been said, or encourage them to describe more about that. Or in the Ingo method, you'd say, put your pen on that part of the sketch and describe more about that. I guess you couldn't do that in Ingo's method because you had to use number 2 pens. And in my thinking back then, I thought that it was really difficult to maintain this first-person perspective and at the same time record. So the job began then to, as an interviewer, my job at that point, because I believed 23 years ago that it was not possible to maintain both perceptions simultaneously. My job then as an interviewer was to structure the session and to give moments of time in which they had their first-person experience and moments of time when they had their second-person experience and moments of time when they could go back and get information and that's the way the interview would work, because I didn't believe at the time that they could maintain both perspectives simultaneously. It was difficult to do. You all know that if you lose contact with the site because of some sort of inclemency, it's not impossible to get right back there. If you have to take a break to go to the bathroom, you can break away from the site. It's not impossible to get back there. Now, your belief system may think that it's difficult. Oh, I've ruined it. I can't do that now. I'm hungry, or I got to take a break, or this, that, the other thing, and I'll never get back there again. But if you believe that you already know everything there is to know about the site, you already have that information because you've been in contact with the site. All our job to do, working together, is to bring that up into your awareness. Then the idea of, oh, I can't get back to the site again. What is getting back to something in a no space-time universe? I mean, there's no place to go kind of situation. It's getting hot in here. Now, in this universe of no place to go, and you already know everything else about that, does that sound a little bit like stage 5 remote viewing? What do you call it? Do you call stage 5?
Stage 5, you're running short. Yeah.
He says I'm talking too long.
Yeah.
Skipping right over it. In Ingo's method of stage 5, it is all about interrogating what you already know. Stage 5 isn't more contact with the target. Stage 5 is all about more contact with what you already know. So even though I was thinking this stuff, 23 years ago, Ingo realize that that's what happens too, that you really already know all this, the challenge is to bring it up, consciousness. So, as I'm coming to the end of this appropriate time. In training remote viewing, it isn't as though I'm going to give you a bunch of information, new facts, and new ideas. It's more like I am going to take away old habits and our usual way of interrelating with the physical world. Because in remote viewing, you're not interrelating with the physical world, you're interrelating with the informational world without space and time. It's quite natural, too, that as you do remote viewing, you come to know that your awareness isn't confined to only your five senses and the things that go on with your body. You become aware that there are other things. So, in summary, in this thing about remote viewing training, I thought everything was a behavior 23 years ago, and that these behaviors could be reduced down into 5 different behaviors. Notice how I'm sudden. Now, it was successful. This worked. You know, I don't know if it was the right system. It's what Lieutenant Atwater came up with at the time, 23 years ago. But it worked. We were actually able to demonstrate remote viewing threat to the security of the Army. And these same remote viewers, as you know, in Schnabel's book, went on later to look at national level intelligence targets. And here's the self-aggrandizing, shameless self-promotion. Here's the self-promotion. In closing here, too bad this isn't remote view. In closing here, I've written a book here, and I want to read to you a section of my book because it's kind of nice closing to what all has been said. So let's come back experientially from 23 years ago back to the present time now. And this is no longer Lieutenant or Captain Atwater talking, this is Skip talking now. Okay? Looking back, my experiences with remote viewing are rapidly becoming remember-when stories imprinted in the retreating memories of my mind. Over the years, I've talked with a variety of people about remote viewing. Some react to the subject of remote viewing with indignant disapproval, others with skepticism, and others very enthusiastically. Sometimes there are those who are seriously interested and wish to get to the bottom of it, whatever that means. These varying reactions seem to be the result of differing educational backgrounds, of spiritual or peak experiences in their own lives, or a level of openness to new information on other things. In the course of their lives, people don't necessarily maintain one certain concept of the world. We change as we move through life. Experience changes and shapes the way of thinking, our very concept of reality. I mean, I knew Russell Targ before he had a personality or a soul. Now, over the years, that's not my book, Russ, that's it. Over the years, some of whom I have spoken about remote viewing have changed their opinions. Those who have a materialistic perspective have been shaped through a one-sided approach of science. Materialists disregard the notion of remote viewing because of the incapacity of proving objective mechanisms responsible for the observed effects. They deem remote viewing impossible right from the start. Therefore, they search for causes that might explain it. They suppose deceit, sleight of hand, or mistakes by the experimenter. Now, a physicalist, people that I talk to, a physicalist perspective holds that remote viewing to be possible as either a conscious or unconscious mental process in a living human being. Extra-dimensional considerations of the phenomena are disregarded because they lack some sort of compulsory proof. Do you like that faith? Let's see you do that with your view graphs, Paul. Numerous protocols are involved for these physicalist people. Numerous protocols are involved to demonstrate the efficacy of remote viewing. There's statistical models and behavioral profiles and double-blind cueing and analytical techniques. And they're all the calling cards of these particular true believers in remote viewing. And then there's another group of people which we might link to spiritualists. Their approach is open to the possibility that remote viewing represents our own multidimensional nature and that reality is more than our physical senses tell us. I have found that many publicly avowed researchers, true believers in remote viewing, are actually closet spiritualists, especially the ones that are psychically experiential themselves. This group, however, endeavors to improve remote viewing methods and techniques with the aim of getting better and more frequent hits, demonstrating their abilities and hence their own personal belief system. These particular true believers want to develop different applications for remote viewing: medical diagnosis, healing, warning of imminent danger of future events. In their enthusiasm, this group is easily seduced to put due caution and critical view of themselves and their own processes aside. They neglect testing the validity of individual remote viewing sessions and run the risk of getting tangled in dependence and blind belief in their own remote viewing skills. Some of these remote viewers consider trivialities and contradictory absurdities to be the ultimate truth, and they even publish such things as being true. And in doing so, they have damaged the legitimate endeavors for responsible remote viewing. I see there to be some sort of a balance in all of these perspectives that I set forth here, an ethical or conscientious viewpoint to all this by taking into account responsible aspects from each school of thought. The materialist perspective provides us being on guard for deceit and trickery. We always have to be on guard for that. Now, some would say that because the government was involved in that, that's probably deceit or trickery to begin with. Now, physicalist approach points out that our unconscious minds may be a repository for remote viewing information, and that we should be careful with scientific investigation of the phenomena because it could help us understand our boundless human abilities. The spiritualist point of view suggests the reality itself is greater than we know, and we're truly more than our physical bodies. So all of these perspectives, I think, are a reasonable way to look at things and to maintain, through remote viewing, we discover who we are as human beings. Let us all now recognize the meaning that has